everybody. Welcome back up to the Vinyl Attic, where we talk about vinyl in the attic. We are in this series, this sort of long-running series about 100 albums that should be in your collection. 100 albums that are so sweet that they belong in your LP box. They're the ones that aren't the normal picks, but ones that are a little, left to center that I think deserve some attention. And so we're talking about an album that sort of really changed things. Today we're talking about the first Roxy Music album, entitled Roxy Music. Eponymous Roxy Music came out June 16th, 1972, the same day as Ziggy Stardust Spiders from Mars, which is one of those obvious albums that you would talk about. This album was recorded in a very short period of time by some really cool cats. Look at that. That's Brian Ferry. Look at Brian Eno there. By Pete Sinfeld, who was the lyricist and the producer from King Crimson, and then put out on Island Records. And there's a lot going on this record. To say that it's eclectic would be an understatement. First of all, we start off with the tradition of the cover model on Roxy Music albums, which continued through the 70s. This woman ended up dating Chris Jagger, Mick Jagger's brother. Their album Siren, the cover was Jerry Hall, who had a long relationship with Mick Jagger, so there's this weird Rolling Stones connection. But the band led by Brian Ferry, who wasn't a kid. He was 26 when this record came out. Art school student, coming from the tradition of art school, which is very big in England, and turning that into music. But joined by Brian Eno, a very young relatively young Brian Eno, who brought in this new thing called electronica into the mix. The album has been described as postmodern, which is a term I'm often trying to explain to my students a lot. If we were to define postmodernism, it would be a incredulity to meta-narratives. As I think that Leotard said that. Meaning, instead of having one style, this is prog rock, this is country rock. You have one. You're mixing all kinds of styles together all at the same time. So you're getting a mix of, there's a little bit of country, there's a lot of glam, there's a lot of progressive rock. There's moments where all of a sudden the Beatles riff will pop into a song. There's Brian Eno wailing on crazy synthesizers and just like weird music that you never heard before, at least not in 1972. And it really kind of breaks the mold. And this again is something we've been talking about in the early 70s when FM radio comes online. There's a single that's released at the same time, Virginia Plain, which isn't on the British version of the album, but it does so well in Britain, makes it all the way to number 4 on the American version of the album, if you get the American version. This is the British version of the album. In fact, I got this in a really great box set in 1981 called Roxy Music, the first 7 albums, were these old days of vinyl and box sets. So I got the first, this is right before Avalon came out, so they did this really cool box set. So it's the British version. And it's crazy music. It's really crazy. It's kind of all over the place in terms of style, in terms of how Brian Ferry is singing. His voice sounds different almost on every track, sometimes within the same song. And it really kind of broke the mold about what a rock band is supposed to be like. There's this presentation. In fact, on the follow-up album, For Your Pleasure, look at these guys. I love Brian Eno right there. Look at that. Who wouldn't want to be listening to that band? This is way before punk and new wave. Even though that these guys, or Roxy Music as a band, got folded into new wave by the late 70s. They created kind of a new genre of art rock that was melding some of the stuff that was happening in the Bowie realm and the sort of glam T-Rex, Ziggy Stardust realm with the prog rock stuff that had been happening with bands like Genesis and Yes, and old school rock and roll. The nostalgia that was happening in the early 70s. This is the era of Happy Days and Sha Na Na and American Graffiti, and kind of throwing it all together in this melange of weird, crazy music. Apparently Brian Ferry didn't like the production of it. He thought it was a little flat, and he has recorded several of these songs on his own later. He's somewhat of a perfectionist. but it created a space for much more creativity. And one of the things that popped into that space that was very new in 1972 was this idea of electronic music. That the synthesizer was sort of a new thing. We were getting little bleeps and blops in the late 60s, like on the Beatles' Abbey Road, for example. And the Monkees also using the Moog synthesizer. But now it was used as sort of a lead instrument for the first time, paving the way for all kinds of electronic music to come, including Kraftwerk and then electronic dance music and ambient music and all the stuff that followed. So Brian Eno really brings in this sort of new thing that you can imagine a lot of people who were hearing about this cool looking band were just sort of blown away by these strange sounds that are on this record that had never really been heard before. It was their fifth album that they really broke out, Siren. That's the album with the song Love is the Drug. Love is the Drug became a staple on FM rock and still is to this day. It's one of the best driving songs ever. But that little sound effect at the beginning of that record of the car starting, I'm assuming everybody knows Love is the Drug, where it's the sound of a car starting up and then driving, then there's all kinds of sound effects on this album. There's sounds of war, there's sounds of crowds, there's sounds of all kinds of things happening. There's all kinds of sort of secret things going on with regards to Brian Ferry, who was a bit of a Casanova. He was kind of carving out this sort of lounge singer Lothario style on the lead track Remake Remodel, which is my favorite song on the album. There's this refrain on it that I didn't know what it was until I looked it up, but there's this part where the band in chorus is singing CPL 583H, 593H, CPL 593H. That is, apparently Brian Ferry saw a beautiful woman in a car, and that was her license plate number, and he thought if he sang the license plate number in the song, she would track him down and they could hook up. I mean, that's just so Brian Ferry, 1970s dude. Just sort of really, the lover of women. That's kind of his style. So this record really had an impact, and I think it was overshadowed by Siren with Love is a Drug, and then 1981 the Avalon record comes out, which is massive. They're sort of their final album. I remember buying that record the day it came out. I had a dorm mate in my freshman dorm named Carlos de la Torre from the Canary Islands in Spain, who was a huge Roxy Music fan. He turned me on to Roxy Music, and we had to buy Avalon the day that it came out, and that record with More Than This and the music video was just sort of the record that most people go to when they want to listen to Roxy Music. No women on the cover. I think it's a Viking on the cover or something. This was the one that started that trend. Brian Eno is long gone by the time we get to Avalon, and they're more of a commercial sounding band that are having songs played on the radio. So I wanted to spend just a wee bit of time on this record because it's so weird and it's so much fun to listen to. The second side is a little bit more mellow. The first side has all the intensity on it. And if you get the American version with Virginia Plain, that is a great, great song. So if you want a record that is just bizarre, but super rockin', it's sort of been described as nerdy art rock meets sexy glam rock. The first Roxy Music album is just so much fun to listen to. You just get the idea of all these art students getting in a room and figuring out what craziness they can come up with. And they recorded the album in a week, and then they got a record deal, and then they released it. So it's really like a project. It's like, hey, let's get together and put on a show. Let's do a play for the neighborhood. It's just this really creative explosion of all these incredibly talented people, including Andy McKay and Phil Manzanera. Just a great bunch of players. Okay, wanted to give a little love to the first Roxy Music album. So great, so great. Next, we don't spend a lot of time talking about greatest hits records. I feel like greatest hits records, sometimes I don't know if we should count them as album releases, or if they do have a value in talking about. I mean, we could do a sort of a top 10 of the greatest hits, the greatest hits albums, I guess. But there is one greatest hits album that for a lot of people was a kind of a gateway drug. was a window into a whole nother genre of music. We're going to talk about Neil Young's decade. Neil Young's first decade of music, triple album. It needs some discussion because it's in a lot of people's collection who are my age, who went to college, and that was their one Neil Young album. So we're going to talk about that next time on Vinyl Fetish. But for now, Roxy Music, they just went back on tour, I think, last year and did a bunch of shows, which is amazing. Not with Eno, but Phil Manzarek and Brian Ferry were out there on the road as Roxy Music. That's so great. Roxy Music matters. Love is a drug. You know it. This first album matters. You matter. So let's talk about it.